Now today I'm going to talk about Luke. I put the ministry of the church, but I should have put Luke and developing a social conscience. Developing a social conscience. Okay? Because that's what the issue is about. And before we get started, we're going to travel back to the ancient world. We'll focus on Galilee in particular, but it applies all over the ancient world. Okay. Today we take it for granted that the community has a responsibility to care for those who need help. All right? So, for example, now, over the years, this has developed in the Western world in two ways. The churches have always had social service agencies, hunger organizations, disaster response, this, that, and the other. The churches have always had this stuff. Okay? Protestant and Catholic, both. Equally. And schools, by the way. And hospitals. When I first moved to Maryland in the early 80s, there was a Lutheran hospital in Baltimore. Closed down because they couldn't compete with the big secular hospitals. But, yeah.
And the one in Portland.
Was there? Yeah. So the church, yeah, and my mother, for the longest time, she was a nurse. She worked for a Lutheran, a convalescent home, nursing home. The whole time we were in North Dakota. And then when she came here, she worked for Sunnyview. Remember Sunnyview?
Yes.
Yeah. She was a nurse at Sunnyview for years. Yeah. Yeah.
That was one of our mission outreaches for the women's group.
Was it? Yeah.
We were at the groundbreaking.
Oh, were you? Yeah. So she was involved in Lutheran elder care organizations all her life. So anyway, but it also in the Western world, not as much in other parts of the world, but in the Western world, by the time you get to the 20th century, the state starts to take on responsibility for social service. Okay? It happens earlier in Western Europe than it does here. But social welfare democracies are Western inventions. Okay? So now it existed here to some degree prior to FDR, but FDR is the one who really expanded it. FDR created Social Security and Medicare, and that's when it started to expand here. Yesterday I was told Social Security is solid until 2035, and then it goes broke.
They keep borrowing from it and never repay.
Yeah. So let's go back to ancient Galilee for a moment. Obviously, the ancient world also had needy people, right? Widows couldn't make their own living. They were completely helpless. Aside from family. And many of them, family was gone. Okay? Orphans. What if the life expectancy wasn't that high? So young people could be orphaned early in their life. And then there again, hopefully there was family that could take over, but there was no it did not occur to people in the ancient world that either the state or a religious organization was responsible to care for needy people. It just didn't occur to people. It's not that they were necessarily uncaring. It just wasn't a part of their culture. Okay? So let me give you an example, give you an illustration of this. As the church, we're all the way in the 3rd century now, the 200s AD. So the church is pretty big at this point. And the Romans got an emperor who wanted to return the empire back to pagan religion. His name was Julian the Apostate. And he couldn't figure out why Christianity was growing and paganism was shrinking. He couldn't figure it out. What's going on here? So he traveled around the empire, and well, what he found out was that the Christian church was caring for the needy in the community, and the pagan priests were busy doing whatever they did. Okay? So Julian told the pagan priests, you have to start to become like the Christians and care for people. Well, it wasn't a part, you see, the stories of the old pagan gods don't have anything in them that would suggest human beings are responsible for one another's well-being, or that human beings should care for each other. Those kinds of stories aren't there. They aren't there. So it wouldn't occur to them, to a pagan priest, to suggest doing that. Because the stories of their gods have nothing to do with that. All right? So, how did things operate now? We're in 1st century Galilee, okay? The first thing I want to point out is that 1st century Galilee, this is old news for some of you who have been to other classes, especially the one on ancient Israel. You might remember that 1st century Galilee had 2 cities, 2 what you could call cities by the standards of the ancient world, not by our standards. Okay, by our standards, they would be very small. Galilee had 2. First one was called Sepphoris. Okay, now Sepphoris was a haven for the wealthy. All of the houses in Sepphoris were like palaces, again, by ancient standards. They had their own baths, they had their own toilet facilities. They had things that nobody else would have, okay, unless you were very wealthy. Okay, so Sepphoris was a wealthy community. It was destroyed around 6 AD. There was an uprising in Galilee. Jesus would have been around 10 years old. And Nazareth was only 7 miles from Sepphoris. So there was an uprising over who was going to rule Galilee. And the Romans, of course, put it down, and they crucified everybody who rebelled, and it was the same old story. Okay, then they finally decided, the Emperor Tiberias, that Herod the Great's son, Herod Antipas, could be the rightful ruler of Galilee. Okay, so Herod Antipas rebuilt Sepphoris, thinking this will be his capital city, because it was the most wealthy, it was wealthy and opulent. It even had a Roman theater in it. All right. Now, remember those passages in the Gospels where Jesus talks about hypocrites? Okay, that's a Greek word that means actor. So Jesus was familiar with that theater. He wouldn't be using that kind of language. Okay? So it's just possible that Sepphoris, while it was being rebuilt, remember Joseph was a what? Yeah. It's just possible that Joseph participated in the rebuilding of Sepphoris and that Jesus may have even been with him. We don't know. But it's possible. In any case, he was aware of that theater. Okay. All right, the other city, Herod eventually, after a couple of years, decides, I think I'd rather have a capital city on the banks of the Sea of Galilee. It's a better view. Okay, so he builds another one. Right? You can see why they're collecting so much taxes from these poor farmers, because he wants to build his cities. So he builds a new city, and he names it after the emperor, Tiberias. Tiberias is still there. It's still a city in Israel. Okay? Ancient Tiberias is a archaeological site behind modern Tiberias, but Tiberias is still there, and it's right on the banks of the Sea of Galilee. And every tour group that goes to Israel stops at the hotel right on the bank of the Sea of Galilee, and they have St. Peter's fish for lunch. If you like fish, it's okay. Otherwise, it's not exactly the best. Okay, anyway. So he builds Tiberias, and of course only the wealthy live in Tiberias because this has the palace of the ruler. It's got all the people that work for him and his rich relatives and the powerful in Galilee. All right? So you got two cities, both wealthy, Sepphoris and Tiberias. Read all four Gospels. It never says one time that Jesus ever entered either one of them. Ever. Now, one of the reasons he may not have entered Tiberias is that Herod built it on top of an ancient Hebrew cemetery, which was against Jewish law. Okay? Just like it's against the law now. You can't build on top of a known burial site. So, but he didn't care. He did what he wanted to. So he built his city on top of this ancient Hebrew burial site. And so many Jews considered the place unclean, ritually unclean. So they wouldn't go there. So that may have been one reason Jesus never entered Tiberias, but he never entered Sepphoris either. Where did he go? Well, if you read any of the four Gospels, you'll read about places like Magdala, Nain, Bethsaida, Capernaum, Nazareth. These are all villages. Okay? They're the villages where the common people live. All right? So, but not just the common people. If you're a resident of Sepphoris or Tiberias, you know who you're going to keep out? You're going to keep out what society considers to be the riffraff. Okay? You won't find a blind beggar in Tiberias. All right? They wouldn't be allowed. You wouldn't find a person who is paralyzed because of a spinal injury or maybe, and you know there was a lot of birth defects because mothers were malnourished. Okay, so blindness was caused by that. So these kinds of the crippled, Jesus refers to them in his parables. Not too long ago, remember the gospel text, Jesus told the Pharisee, when you have a banquet, invite the blind, the lame, the crippled, well, he's talking about the people who nobody cares about. Okay, so the villages are populated by the common people. Now, that doesn't mean that there may not have been a few people there that were fairly prosperous. But nevertheless, if they had a little more land than most people had, they may have been a little more prosperous, but nobody was rich. They were mostly subsistence farmers who could raise enough crops to feed their families for a year at a time. And they were the riffraff of society, the people nobody cared about, okay? There was no home for the aged. There was no place for the mentally deranged. There was no hospital. There was none of the institutions we take for granted in our society in ancient Galilee. Nothing. Nothing. Okay? So if you didn't have family to care for you, you were out of luck. You really were. You lived on the street. Okay? These are the places where Jesus goes. Spends all his time in these villages. Okay? Remember, he tells his disciples when they're in a place, they stay for a while, and he says, we've got to go on, so I get to the other villages. But it's also the villages, not the cities. The villages. And then when he gets there, large crowds follow him around. Okay? So, why are these large crowds following him around, do you think?
Healing?
For help,
That's a big reason, healing. They're looking for healing. Yeah.
just for help, which would have been.
Yeah. And in the case of the loaves and the fishes, they were hungry. So he fed them. You know, a lot of people think that happened only once in Jesus' ministry. It actually happened twice. He did it twice. Matthew records both of them, so does Luke. At one, there were 5,000 counted, according to the text. That's probably a little bit of an overcount. And then 4,000 at the other one. Okay, so he feeds these people. All right, in other words, Jesus is a one-man social service organization. He is. He's doing it all. He's a hospital. He's a food pantry. He cares for the spiritual needs of the people. So he's, you know, like a spiritual counselor. He's doing it all. Okay? And he's got his disciples following him around, watching him do these things, while he's telling them, eventually, you're going to do these things. Not me, but you. You're going to do these things. Okay? So Jesus is literally inventing our social conscience. That's what he's doing. All right? The idea that society is responsible to care for its helpless population came from him. And Luke emphasizes this more than any of them. Okay? And the best example, of course, and we're going to walk through this in detail so that you get all the nuances of it, is the parable of the Good Samaritan. Okay? That's in the Gospel of Luke. It's not in any of the other Gospels. Only Luke has it. All right? So, here's the context. Jesus is teaching. A lawyer stands up. Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Jesus says, well, what does the law say? What do the commandments say? Well, For you shall love the Lord your God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. Jesus says, you are right. Go and do that, and you will live. And then Jesus is about to move on, but the guy interrupts him. But wait a minute, Rabbi. Who is my neighbor? Then Luke puts in a little phrase, he asked this to justify himself. What Luke means by that is that the lawyer wants to narrow down the definition of the neighbor. Okay? So that it doesn't, if it's too expansive, that means he's going to be responsible for people he doesn't want to be responsible for. Right? Okay, so Jesus answers that question, who is my neighbor, by crafting the parable of the Good Samaritan. All right. So, according to the parable, a guy's walking on a narrow road between Jericho and Jerusalem. A road that was known to be unsafe. It had gangs of bandits on it, because it was out in the middle of nowhere. Okay, and a group of bandits get a hold of this guy, they steal everything he has, they beat him to a pulp and leave him on the side of the road, bleeding. So there he is, okay? Who's responsible for this guy? Anybody? Nobody? Is anybody responsible for this guy? In their time, there were no institutions that took responsibility. Not a one. No, they just didn't exist. Okay? And of course, medicine, as we know it, is an invention of the post-scientific revolution of the 17th century. That's a long way in coming. All right? Even at the time of the Civil War, they didn't understand infection. When a soldier got hit in the leg with one of those bullets, and those bullets were made to shatter the bones, okay, so they couldn't be repaired. All they could do is cut off their leg. They amputated it. And they did it with unsterilized saws. That's how they did it. Anesthesia, painkillers, whiskey. That's what you got. Okay? So it was not a pretty picture. We didn't understand for the longest time what caused infection. Anyway, okay, so this guy's by the side of the road. First comes by a priest. Priest walks to the other side of the road, so he can't see the guy laying there and passes by. Out of sight, out of mind, right? He doesn't want to take responsibility for this guy. Moreover, if he gets any blood on him, he becomes ritually unclean and he has to go through all these rituals. He doesn't want to do that. So he passes by so that he can continue to be concerned about his own personal affairs and not be bothered with some guy on the side of the road. Then comes a Levite, the people who led them in worship. Same thing. Goes to the other side of the road, passes by. Out of sight, out of mind. I don't want to worry about him. I got other things to think about. All right. Then along comes a Samaritan. Now there's the first message. The first message, because Samaritans were believed to be people who did not understand or practice the law of Moses properly. They were heretics. They were not good people. Okay, there was a terrible stereotype about who Samaritans were that operated in Jewish society. Samaritans were bad. Jesus makes a Samaritan a good guy. Now that's the first message about who your neighbor is. By picking a Samaritan to be the good guy, he's already expanding the definition of who your neighbor is beyond your own community. When most people thought of their neighbor, they thought of their own little clan, okay? Their own group, nobody else, not foreigners. Foreigners were not included. Just their group was their neighbor, okay? And that's what this lawyer wants Jesus to, he wants to narrow the definition of what a neighbor is. So the very fact that he picks the Samaritan right away, that expands it, okay? Second thing is that the Samaritan, what does the Samaritan do? Well, he doesn't just render aid. He goes beyond that. Okay, first he does the immediate first aid. He had some oils and stuff they used to put on wounds back then. So he did what he could according to the knowledge that they had at the time. And then he put him on his animal, donkey or whatever it was, and he took him to an innkeeper. Okay? And he paid the innkeeper for the care of this guy so that he could rest and recuperate, hopefully heal over time. I'll pay for his room, the guy says, the Samaritan. But then he adds, if he needs anything beyond what I'm giving you now, send the bill to me, I'll pay for it. Okay? So then, after Jesus tells the parable, okay, now the Samaritan in the parable is the social service agency, okay, a one-man social service. A disaster happened to this guy. He was the doctor, he was the social worker who got him into a place to stay. He was all of it, okay? And not only that, he funded it. He paid for it. Okay? And then Jesus asks the lawyer, who was a neighbor to the man who was beaten? Was it the priest, the Levite, or the Samaritan? Well, I guess it was the Samaritan. He says disappointed. Okay. All right. So, what is Jesus saying in this parable? If not, that we as a community are responsible for our needy members. We are responsible for the care of the needy, no matter what the issue might be, whether it's an illness or food deprivation or homeless, victim of a crime, whatever it might be, the community is responsible to care for the needs of those who can't care for themselves.
Excuse me, so in other words, I am not a good Samaritan or a good neighbor today because I look the other way on El Camino and Hillsdale for the men standing on the corner saying homeless and need food. I did not give them money, I just looked straight ahead and kept driving.
Okay, well, we're going to make that a subject of discussion here in a second. Okay? Because that's a very good question. It's a good question. There's a place on my commute when I come off the freeway into Castro Valley where homeless people tend to congregate with signs.
Yes.
Need food. Yeah. So I know exactly what you're talking about. Okay, so, but before we get to the specifics of each of us, the thing that we need to understand about the Gospel of Luke all the Gospels really, but the Gospel of Luke in particular, emphasizes it. Just like I said, Luke emphasized Jesus' ministry to women, and we talked about what the meaning of the Christmas story was. Luke does this more than the other ones do. Okay, that's why the parable of the Good Samaritan is in Luke and not in the others. Okay, so,
Of course, Luke was a doctor.
yes, he was. Yes, he was. Yeah. I should mention, you know, medicine did exist in the ancient world. It was invented by the Greeks, not the Hebrews. And it was, obviously, it was rudimentary at the time. What happens then is over time. Okay, so let's do just a really quick summary here. What happens then is that Jesus, of course, after his resurrection, he ascends back to his Father. He gives responsibility for what he was doing to his disciples. And within a very short period of time, the disciples are overwhelmed by the amount of work, both preaching the word and caring for the needy, that they develop the what?
Deacons.
Yeah, the diaconate. Okay? So even, we went through this in the book of Acts, even in the first few years of the church had a social conscience that was passed on to it by Jesus. Okay? You're responsible to care for others. And so anyone who came into the community was cared for. How did they do it? Well, Luke hints at that rather clearly when he talks about the fact that early members of the Christian community in that day and age, when nobody had a lot of money, had to commit to using their resources for the good of the community itself. Okay, so they would have what they needed to care for the widows and the orphans, as they put it. All right? Okay, so over time, the church develops social service ministry. Okay? What's the name of one of our committees in this church? Social concerns. Okay? Name the number of agencies in the ELCA that deals with this kind of thing. Lutheran Social Services, ELCA World Hunger Relief, Disaster Response, and there's several others. And also resettlement of immigrants. That was a big thing back after the Vietnam War. A lot of churches sponsored the resettlement of Vietnamese after the Vietnam War.
We did a lot of them.
Did you? Yeah. See? Okay, so as America developed, here in our own country, as America developed, it was not until the 20th century that government started to take on this responsibility. Prior to that, it was the churches. The churches built hospitals, the churches built nursing homes, the churches had food pantries, the churches had all these ministries. Old age homes, everything, all right? Both Catholic and Protestant. And not only that, they also educated children. Yeah. Because, you know, if you break up Jesus' ministry into its component parts, he was a teacher, a preacher, and a healer. Okay, all of those things became the responsibility of the church that he founded. So then as time went by, and this happened quicker in Western Europe. The United States remained more of a religious country than Western Europe did, longer. Okay. In Western Europe, Scandinavia is a good example. In Western Europe, the state took over. Okay, and your taxes paid for it. Yeah. But in this country, up until FDR's time, FDR started it with Social Security and Medicare, and then it started to expand under LBJ in particular. You remember the Great Society? Okay, even I was alive for that. I remember LBJ very well. But anyway, yeah, so it expanded here over time, especially from LBJ's time on. But the point is that the development of a social conscience, that society is responsible to care for its needy, is something that grew out of our Christian heritage. It didn't come out of nowhere. It wasn't some philosopher sitting in his study thinking, I think people ought to take care of each other. That's not how it happened. It grew out of our Christian heritage. And the church was involved in it in an even bigger way in the past. Now, government does far more than the church does. And your taxes pay for it. Okay. All right, so let's talk about the problem that Shirley mentioned. Okay, we have a homeless problem in California. We just do. Why aren't we doing something about it? I mean, surely you could go give that guy $5, $20, $100. That's not going to solve the problem.
No, probably use it for drugs.
And he's probably wouldn't use it for food anyway.
He may not. We don't know, but he may not. Okay, so why aren't we doing something about it?
They say they don't.
Partly they won't accept money.
That's right, they're spending a lot of money for nothing.
Accepted.
There was a time here, and I don't know if they're still doing it, when they were contacting family to take these people, and the family said, okay, they would put them on a bus and send them home, but they had no control if they got off the bus halfway between here and,
True enough.
yeah. And there was one fellow who came from one of the southern states and took his brother home with him, and the brother sneaked out and came back because
Yeah.
he didn't like the confinement.
Yeah. No, there's no simple answer to the problem. There's no easy answer. My brother's wife has a brother just like that. He's been homeless in Texas for years, and my brother tried to help him financially to get on his feet and get him off the streets, and he decided he'd rather live on the streets. Yeah,
It's a problem.
yeah, it is.
And we closed down all of our mental hospitals. So-
That's sad.
So there's just no place to put them
Yeah, yeah.
and get them help.
Yeah, the institutions that we had in place, you're right, they were closed down. Yeah.
That is a major factor. I can well remember the 70s when some of those big in Southern California, when Patton was one of the big ones down there, closed down, and it was literally, within a year or two, it was like The Walking Dead. It was all these zombies, these people walking out on the street. However, Patton wasn't that great a place. Then you begin to hear the stories. I mean, it was an asylum in the traditional old style.
Yeah,
So
Yeah, those old asylums weren't perfect, that's for sure. But we, you know, let's take substance abuse. We've learned a lot since then. And there are medicines that doctors can use to help people get off of the substance to which they're addicted with a minimum of uncomfortable symptoms. I mean a minimum. Yeah. It can be done.
The other thing is it's a symptom of the breakup of the larger extended families, that they have nowhere to go, that they've been distributed across the country and continue
They run
to
away
grow
from
small.
home.
Yes, right.
Yeah, it's not an easy thing to solve. But I do think we could be doing more than we are. That's just my 2 cents. So, but I think that it's really, really important to understand the connection between the Christian faith and what I'm calling a social conscience. The idea that we as a community are responsible to help the helpless. And so, here at Hope, for example, we're buying, cornbread boxes, right?
Yeah, 400 of them.
Yeah, 400 of those. Social human, I keep calling it social concern, social concern. My former church, it was called human concern. It's built into our budget. And we usually have fundraisers for one project or another over at Samaritan House every year. It's just a part of being the church. Okay, everybody, thank you very much. We don't have any, there's only two more. And that'll be it.
Oh, okay.
Until after the holidays. Okay, 2 more.